There was a particular sound that once defined the arrival of the holiday season across the American heartland, a sound so deeply embedded in the culture of a generation that its absence today speaks louder than words. It was not the resonant chime of a church bell echoing through a snow-dusted town square, nor was it the warm, familiar crackle of birchwood splitting open in a fireplace on a cold winter evening. It was something far more grounded, far more immediate. It was the heavy, satisfying thud of a thick paper catalog landing inside a metal mailbox at the end of a long, snow-covered driveway. In the soft gray light of a November afternoon in 1965, that single sound carried the weight of anticipation, the promise of possibility, and the quiet electricity of a season beginning. That sound was the arrival of the Sears catalog, and to anyone who experienced it firsthand, no further explanation was necessary. To a modern ear accustomed to the instant gratification of a smartphone screen, it is genuinely difficult to communicate the sheer physical and emotional significance of that object. This was not simply a magazine. It was not a promotional flyer stuffed between utility bills. It was an event unto itself, a massive, dense volume of paper often exceeding 1,500 pages, bound with the smell of fresh ink and the intoxicating weight of infinite possibility. People called it the Wish Book, a name that sounds almost too romantic for what was essentially a retail inventory list, and yet the name fit perfectly. For the millions of American families living in the vast, often isolated stretches of the country, the farmers in Nebraska, the coal miners in West Virginia, the ranchers in Montana, the mill workers in small Appalachian towns, this catalog was far more than a shopping guide. It was their primary connection to the broader commercial world. It was the internet assembled from paper. It was a portal through which a working man on a quiet homestead could browse the same suits, the same appliances, the same tools, and the same toys available to a banker living in a Manhattan brownstone. In a country defined by its geographic and economic divisions, the Sears catalog was a powerful and quiet equalizer. Children across the country would spend weeks lying on their stomachs in front of glowing fireplaces, carefully circling the items they dared to dream about, folding down the corners of pages until the paper grew warm, soft, and worn from the loving repetition of their fingers. The arrival of the catalog was a collective ritual, a seasonal ceremony that carried genuine emotional weight. It meant that your household was connected, that somewhere in the great commercial machinery humming deep inside the cities, your family had not been overlooked. The Wish Book said in its own way that you mattered, that your aspirations were valid, that the world of modern convenience was not only for the wealthy or the well-positioned, but for anyone with an address and a dream. If you were to drive through those same American towns today and search for a monument bearing the Sears name, you would find something profoundly different. Where the Wish Book once arrived full of promise, you would now find a building standing in silence. Drive toward the outer edge of town, past the stretch of asphalt parking lots where the painted lines have faded and the concrete has begun to crack along its edges, where persistent weeds push upward through the fractured surface with the quiet determination of life reclaiming its space. There, anchoring the far end of a quieted shopping mall, sits what was once a Sears department store. The large, iconic block letters that once spelled out the company name have been carefully removed from the facade, leaving behind only the faded outlines on the brick, like a watermark pressed into the surface of a page, the shadow of a name that once commanded more public confidence than almost any institution in the country. The glass doors are secured. The interior is dim. The air inside has grown still, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of a space that has not seen commerce in years. If you pressed your face close to the dusty glass and looked inside, you would see the long scratches on the floor tiles where glass display cases once stood in proud rows, and the empty brackets on the walls where Craftsman tools once hung in gleaming chrome formations, each one a standing promise of a lifetime of reliable service. It is a scene of extraordinary cultural weight. It is not simply a store that has closed. It is a chapter of American commercial life that has come to a close, quietly, without ceremony, and with a finality that still resonates. The story of Sears is not simply a business case study about shrinking profit margins or executive leadership decisions made in corporate boardrooms. It is a far more meaningful story than that. It is the story of the breaking of a covenant, a sacred, unspoken agreement between a company and its people that had been honored for over a century before it was finally allowed to expire. For more than 100 years, this company did not merely sell merchandise. It sold a vision of life. It sold the American dream in a tangible, deliverable form. And it did so quite literally. In the early years of the 20th century, a customer could open the pages of the Sears catalog and order not a piece of furniture or a set of dishes, but an entire home. Not a model. Not a scaled-down replica. A full-sized, two-story family home, engineered and packaged for delivery by rail car, arriving in thousands of carefully numbered pieces. The lumber, the nails, the shingles, the window frames, the interior trim, the paint, and a detailed set of illustrated instructions, all of it ordered from a catalog and assembled on a plot of land by the hands of a man and his neighbors, using tools they had also purchased from the same catalog. Nearly 70,000 of these Sears modern homes still stand in neighborhoods across the United States today, quietly remarkable structures occupied by families who may not even be aware that the walls sheltering them were once chosen from a printed page and shipped by train. These homes are living monuments to a time when a single American company offered to provide the very structure beneath which the nation rested its head. The depth of that trust was extraordinary. Americans trusted Sears with the refrigerator that preserved their food through summer heat. They trusted Sears with the tires rolling beneath their families on long highway drives. They trusted Sears with the furnace warming their homes in the depths of January. The Craftsman brand name was not merely a marketing identity stamped onto metal products. It was a covenant of permanence. If a customer purchased a wrench from Sears and that wrench failed, even 40 years after the purchase, even without a receipt, even without proof of any kind, the customer could walk into any Sears location in the country, hand the broken tool across the counter, and walk out with a brand new replacement without question, without argument, and without hesitation. That policy was not just good business. It was a philosophical statement about the kind of company Sears intended to be. It was a declaration that said, clearly and without reservation, we are not in the business of transactions. We are in the business of relationships. We are here and we intend to remain here, and we stand behind every single thing we place in your hands. The extraordinary dimension of this story lies in understanding how something so deeply trusted and so thoroughly woven into the fabric of American life reached a turning point. The Sears story reached a critical juncture because of a particular kind of overconfidence that tends to settle into institutions once they have reached the very top of their field. The men who eventually led the company from the executive floors above Chicago stopped maintaining their direct line of sight to the customer standing at the end of the driveway. They constructed the tallest building ever built by human hands, a towering black monolith of steel that scraped the upper atmosphere and announced to the world that Sears was not merely a business but a civilization unto itself. And in doing so, they created a kind of physical and psychological distance between themselves and the people who had built their empire with their loyalty. The company became increasingly absorbed by financial instruments, credit products, and real estate ventures. And as the executive attention drifted upward into the clouds, the soul of the business, that irreplaceable human connection with the working men and women of America, was quietly left behind. The story we are about to explore is the full account of how this extraordinary journey unfolded. It begins with a young railway station agent in the windswept plains of Minnesota who spotted an opportunity inside a wooden crate of abandoned pocket watches. It rises through the construction of what was essentially a self-contained commercial city on the west side of Chicago, with its own power grid, its own hospital, and its own newspaper. And it concludes with the long, deliberate process by which one of the most trusted institutions in American history gradually stepped away from the very foundation that made it great. It is a story that runs parallel, in many ways, to the broader story of the American middle class itself, a remarkable rise to levels of prosperity and security that had never been seen before, followed by a slow and confusing drift away from the things that once made it strong. When we look at the quiet, darkened windows of a former Sears store today, we are looking at the end of an idea that once burned very brightly, the idea that a company could be something more than a place where money changed hands. The idea that a company could be a genuine partner in the lives of its customers. That idea was not destroyed overnight. It was gradually and quietly set aside through a series of choices driven by overconfidence, by the seductive pull of financial complexity, and by a failure to understand that the true value of the Sears empire had never resided in the floors of its tower. It had always lived in the trust of the person waiting at the mailbox. The silence of an empty retail space carries a particular kind of weight. But if you listen carefully enough to the full sweep of this company's history, you can still hear the distant echo of that satisfying thud of the catalog arriving in the mailbox, the sound of a promise being made before the world changed around it. The wish book closed its final pages. The lights dimmed slowly. And what remained was a quiet invitation for us to understand exactly how something so permanent, so trusted, and so deeply loved could gradually fade from the world it once defined so completely. The foundation of what would one day become the most powerful retail empire in the world was laid not through a calculated business plan or a carefully prepared investor pitch, but through a fortunate encounter with a shipping mistake in one of the smallest, most overlooked corners of America. In the year 1886, A wooden crate containing a collection of gold-filled pocket watches arrived on the platform of a modest railway station in North Redwood, Minnesota, a settlement so small it barely registered as a town. The watches had been ordered by a local jeweler who, for reasons lost to history, had a change of heart and declined to accept the shipment. The crate sat quietly on the platform, its contents ticking away in the darkness, unclaimed and awaiting return to the original sender. It represented, on the surface, a simple logistical inconvenience. A minor commercial error with no particular significance. But the young man who served as the station agent that day looked at that crate and saw something else entirely. His name was Richard Warren Sears and he was 22 years old. He was not a trained merchant. He had no background in retail, no formal education in commerce, and no established network of business contacts. What he possessed instead was something far more rare and difficult to manufacture, an almost supernatural instinct for the mechanics of human desire. He was the kind of man whose mind operated at a frequency slightly faster than the world around him, always running calculations that no one else had thought to run, always spotting the gap between what existed and what was possible. When Richard Sears looked at that crate of unclaimed watches, he did not see an abandoned shipment. He saw an opening in the fabric of commerce that had been sitting there, unnoticed, for as long as people had been buying and selling things. His insight was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than returning the watches to the manufacturer, he purchased them outright for a negotiated price. He then began writing letters and sending telegraphs to other railway station agents positioned along the line, offering the watches at a discounted rate that bypassed the traditional retail markup entirely. Railway station agents were perfectly positioned to receive, inspect, and sell small merchandise items. They were trusted figures in their communities. They had access to the same rail network that moved the goods. And they were, like Sears himself, always alert to an opportunity to supplement the modest wages of their position. The strategy worked with a speed that surprised even Sears. Within a few weeks, the watches were gone, the profit was real, and the young station agent had his first taste of what it felt like to see a commercial idea come alive. Within months, he had accumulated enough capital to leave the railroad entirely, relocate to Minneapolis, and begin building what he already understood at some level would be something far larger than a side project. But Richard Sears had a structural limitation that would define the next phase of his story. He was a visionary and a communicator of extraordinary talent. He understood the customer, the message, and the movement of product through a network with intuitive clarity. What he lacked was the technical foundation to ensure the quality and reliability of the merchandise he sold. The watches he had been moving through his growing network were often inconsistent in their craftsmanship, and when they required service or repair, Sears had no answer for the customer standing in front of him with a broken timepiece. He needed a partner, someone whose strengths were precisely where his own abilities found their limits. He placed an advertisement in a Chicago newspaper seeking a watchmaker, and the individual who responded would become one of the most consequential yet underappreciated figures in the history of American retail. His name was Alva Curtis Roebuck. He was a quiet, methodical watch repairman from the state of Indiana, a man whose temperament stood in nearly complete contrast to the restless, expansive energy of Richard Sears. Where Sears operated on instinct and momentum, Roebuck operated on precision and patience. Where Sears saw possibility in every direction simultaneously, Roebuck saw the steps required to move from one point to the next with reliability. The partnership they formed was the classic and enduring pairing of American enterprise, the magnetic visionary and the grounded craftsman. Sears was the voice. Roebuck was the hands. Together they covered the full spectrum of what a business needs to not only grow but to function with integrity. In 1893 they formally incorporated as Sears, Roebuck and Company, established their headquarters in Chicago, then the undisputed center of the American rail network, and set about building something that the country had not yet seen. It was in Chicago that Richard Sears revealed the full dimension of his genius, and it was a genius rooted not in product development or operational management but in something far more intimate, the ability to speak directly to the heart of the American consumer in a way that felt personal, urgent, and true. Sears understood something that most merchants of his era had not yet grasped. The rural farmers spread across the enormous American prairie, the men and women who worked the land from before sunrise to after sunset and who had built this country's agricultural foundation with their labor, were being significantly underserved by the commercial system around them. Their only access to goods was through local general stores, establishments that often operated as near monopolies in isolated communities and charged prices that reflected their unchallenged position in the local market. The selection was limited. The quality was inconsistent. And the prices were set not by competition but by geography. Richard Sears decided to step directly into that gap and offer the American farmer something no one had offered before: access to the full breadth of the commercial world at fair prices, delivered directly to wherever they happened to live. He accomplished this through the mail, and he accomplished it through the power of language that was unlike anything the catalog business had ever produced. Richard Sears was, by any honest assessment, one of the most effective commercial writers in American history. When he wrote about a product in the catalog, he did not describe it in the detached, clinical language of an inventory sheet. He romanced it. He brought it to life. He wrote with a breathless, energetic enthusiasm that made the reader feel as though the item being described was personally selected with their specific needs in mind. He wrote the farmer into the story. He positioned Sears not as a distant corporation but as a trusted friend who understood the customer's situation and was actively working on their behalf against the forces of overpricing and limited access. He coined the phrase "satisfaction guaranteed or your money back," and in doing so he didn't merely introduce a customer service policy. He inverted centuries of commercial tradition. The age-old principle of buyer beware, the assumption that once a sale was made, the responsibility shifted entirely to the purchaser, was replaced by something radical in its simplicity: accountability on the part of the seller. If you are not satisfied, your money comes back to you. No argument. No conditions. No fine print. The response from the American public was immediate and overwhelming. Orders did not trickle in, they arrived in volumes that strained every system the young company had in place. Sears expanded its offerings with remarkable speed, moving from watches into clothing, furniture, firearms, agricultural tools, musical instruments, bicycles, and eventually into almost every category of consumer goods imaginable. By 1895, the catalog had grown to 500 pages. But the very velocity of that growth introduced a new and serious challenge that the company was not yet equipped to manage. The internal operations of Sears, Roebuck and Company in those early years had a quality of creative, productive chaos. Richard Sears would launch promotional campaigns that outpaced the company's ability to fulfill them. He would advertise items before the supply chain had confirmed they were available, trusting his ability to source the product before the orders became urgent. The warehouse was a scene of constant motion and considerable pressure, an environment built entirely around the energy of its founder rather than the requirements of a scalable system. This environment, electric and exciting as it was, proved to be more than Alva Roebuck was built to sustain. The quiet watchmaker from Indiana had signed on to be the technical backbone of a mail-order watch business. What he found himself inside instead was a rapidly expanding commercial enterprise with a financial footprint and an operational scale that grew larger by the week. The weight of the debt required to fund the expansion, the relentless pace of the operation, and the unpredictability of working alongside a founder who operated primarily on instinct and boldness began to take a measurable toll on Roebuck's health and peace of mind. In 1895, having concluded that the company was expanding beyond a point he could comfortably support, Alva Roebuck made the decision to step away. He sold his one-third ownership stake in the company for $25,000, a comfortable sum at the time, enough to provide security and a reasonable start to a quieter chapter of his life. What Roebuck could not have known, and what makes his decision one of the most extraordinary miscalculations in the history of American business, is that the stake he sold for $25,000 would, within a few short decades, have been worth hundreds of millions. He stepped away from one of the greatest fortunes in the history of commerce because he valued his peace above his ambition. History has recorded his name in the title of the company. But his share of the outcome was surrendered at precisely the moment the story was about to become extraordinary. With Roebuck's departure, Richard Sears found himself holding an empire that was outgrowing his ability to sustain it alone. The business needed capital and it needed something Sears had never particularly valued: organizational discipline. The man who would bring both of those things to the table, and who would ultimately reshape the company's identity in the process, was a clothing manufacturer from Cincinnati named Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald was everything that Richard Sears was not in terms of operational sensibility. He was methodical, data-driven, and deeply focused on systems. He looked at the productive disorder of the Sears warehouse and understood immediately that the company's future depended on transforming it into something more structured and repeatable. He invested in the business and applied his talents with the precision and commitment of someone who understood that the volume of commerce flowing through this organization would only grow, and that it had to be managed with far greater rigor than personal energy alone could provide. Rosenwald introduced what became known as the schedule system, a method of order fulfillment that was, for its time, an engineering achievement as impressive as any mechanical invention of the era. Incoming orders were received, opened, sorted, and dispatched through the warehouse on a strict timed sequence. Products moved along conveyor belts and through pneumatic tube systems. Every department knew exactly when their portion of an order needed to be completed. The result was a level of fulfillment speed and accuracy that transformed the customer experience and allowed the company to scale its operations without losing its commitment to reliability. Julius Rosenwald had built what was, in effect, a human-powered logistics engine of breathtaking sophistication. He had taken the fire that Richard Sears had lit and given it a fireplace capable of containing it. But as the infrastructure of the company grew more refined and more corporate in its character, the friction between the two dominant forces within it became increasingly difficult to manage. Richard Sears was a man of the 19th century in the fullest sense. A hustler, a storyteller, a salesman of prodigious talent who operated on inspiration and personal connection. Julius Rosenwald was a man of the emerging 20th century, organized, profit-conscious, and committed to building a company that could outlast the personality of any single individual. Their visions for what the company should be and how it should behave were fundamentally different. Sears wanted to keep pushing, keep advertising, keep following every promising instinct wherever it led. Rosenwald wanted margins, forecasting, and predictable growth. When the board of directors, increasingly composed of investors who valued the balance sheet over the brand story, were asked to choose between the two philosophies, they chose the one that offered them something they could measure. The story of Richard Sears from this point forward is one of the most quietly affecting narratives in American business history. The man who created the machine that bore his name, who had built an empire from the energy of his own imagination and the warmth of his relationship with the American working class, found himself progressively moved to the periphery of the organization he had willed into existence. He had built something that grew beyond the boundaries of what one man's personality could contain, and the structure that replaced that personality had less and less room for the man who started it all. In 1908, Richard Sears resigned from the presidency. He left the building as a wealthy man. He also left as a man who had been separated from the work that defined him, and the evidence suggests that this separation was a loss from which he never fully recovered. He passed away just 6 years later at the age of 50, with a fortune in his name but a quietness about him that spoke to the particular longing of someone who built something great and then had to watch it go on without them. The departure of the founders was not simply a leadership transition. It marked a subtle but significant shift in the character of the organization. The frantic, personal, deeply human quality of the company's early identity, the sense that Sears was a voice speaking directly and honestly to the customer, began to give way to something more institutional, more calculated, and more focused on scale than on connection. Alva Roebuck, whose name remained painted across the side of the building, eventually returned to the company during the economic challenges of the 1930s, working for a salary in an organization that had once been partly his. He was, by then, a living reminder of a founding story that the modern company had largely moved past. The men who now ran Sears saw the catalog not as a conversation but as a distribution channel. They saw the customer not as a neighbor to be served but as a market to be captured. They were extraordinarily effective at scaling and managing what the founders had built. But something essential had shifted in the process, and the effects of that shift would only become visible many decades later, when the distance between the company and its customers had grown too wide to bridge. By the early decades of the 20th century, Sears, Roebuck and Company had grown beyond the boundaries of any conventional definition of a retail business. To truly understand the scale of what this organization had become, you had to stand in the West Side neighborhood of North Lawndale in Chicago and look up at the massive brick complex known as the Homan Avenue facility, later called Homan Square, which opened its doors in 1906 as the largest commercial building on the face of the earth. This was not a warehouse in any conventional sense of the word. It was a city. It was a self-contained, fully functioning commercial metropolis spread across 40 acres of urban land, built from millions of red bricks and supported by iron frameworks that spoke to the industrial confidence of the age. It had its own power station, generating electricity sufficient to light an entire small town. It had its own medical facility, staffed and equipped. It operated its own fire brigade and maintained its own printing house that produced a company newspaper read by tens of thousands of employees. It ran its own private security operation and housed within its walls a complete railroad siding that connected the facility directly to the national rail network. It was, in every practical sense, a sovereign commercial state operating inside the borders of a major American city. Inside this cathedral of commerce, the daily operation was a spectacle of organized human effort on a scale that had no precedent. Orders arrived by the sackload, thousands upon thousands every single day, each envelope containing the written hopes and consumer aspirations of an American family somewhere across the country. These letters were opened by teams of workers, sorted, documented, and sent through the pneumatic tube network to the relevant departments across the facility. Ice skates, violins, tombstones, baby carriages, sewing machines, and surgical tools moved along miles of conveyor belts and spiral chutes, each item following a precisely timed path toward the packing stations where it would be prepared for its journey by rail to the customer's front door. It was the physical internet, a system of almost incomprehensible logistical complexity functioning without a single transistor, without a single line of code, powered entirely by human intelligence, physical infrastructure, and the will of an organization that genuinely believed it was providing a service worth providing. The Homan Avenue complex was, in the deepest sense, the beating heart of the enterprise. It was a place where the connection between the company and the customer was tangible, where an executive standing at any window in the building could see the railroad tracks running alongside the structure, loaded with freight cars containing the merchandise that would reach American homes by the weekend. The ground was real. The work was real. The product was real. And for several decades, that reality kept the organization grounded in the fundamental truth of what it was: a company built on the delivery of reliable goods to people who needed them. But institutions that rise to the very heights of their industry often develop an appetite for something beyond their original purpose. As the decades passed and the company's dominance in American retail became so complete that it accounted for nearly 1% of the entire national economy at its peak, the men who led the company from their executive suites began to view the brick complex on the West Side in a different light. It was noisy. It was industrial. It occupied a working-class neighborhood that had none of the polish or prestige that the company's leadership felt they had earned. The executives of the 1960s and 1970s, men trained in finance and strategy rather than in retail and operations, looked around at the sprawling physical reality of the Homan facility and saw not a monument to American enterprise but a reminder of where the company had begun, which was a place they felt they had long since surpassed. They wanted a headquarters that would communicate unmistakably and to the entire world the full magnitude of Sears's position at the top of the American commercial order. They wanted glass. They wanted height. They wanted something that would make every other building in every other city in the country appear modest by comparison. In 1969, the Sears leadership announced a plan of staggering ambition. They would vacate the Homan Avenue complex, consolidating thousands of office employees into a single downtown structure located in the heart of Chicago's Loop District. The structure they intended to build would not simply be a headquarters. It would be the tallest building in the history of human construction. The Sears Tower, completed in 1973, was an engineering achievement of the first order. It was a bundled system of 9 steel tubes rising 110 stories above street level, clad in black aluminum and tinted bronze glass, a dark and imposing column of architectural ambition that announced, in the most literal possible terms, that Sears was at the very top of the world. It was an extraordinary building. It remains one of the most recognized structures on Earth. But the building was also the outward expression of an inward turn that would prove enormously consequential. The move to the tower represented a decisive shift in the relationship between the company's leadership and the physical reality of the business they were running. In the Homan facility, the executives were surrounded daily by merchandise, by the sound of the schedule system, by the sight and smell of a warehouse operating at full capacity. The product was everywhere. The operation was visible and immediate. In the tower, the executives rode high-speed elevators to floors positioned so far above the street that the city below was a graphic abstraction, a pattern of rooftops and traffic seen from a perspective so elevated that the individual human beings moving through the streets were no longer visible. They had, quite literally, elevated themselves above the world they were serving. And the psychological effect of that elevation was not trivial. From that altitude, the retail business, the day-to-day work of managing store layouts, maintaining product quality, hiring knowledgeable staff, and staying attuned to the evolving preferences of the American shopper, began to feel like a lower-order concern. The leadership, now populated increasingly by financial professionals, lawyers, and strategists rather than by merchants and operators, became captivated by a more sophisticated vision for the company. They believed that the enormous reservoir of trust that American consumers had placed in the Sears name extended beyond appliances and tools. They believed that a customer who trusted Sears with their wrench purchase would also extend that trust to their savings account, their mortgage, their insurance policy, and their investment portfolio. Under the ambitious umbrella slogan of "Socks and Stocks," the company launched one of the most aggressive diversification strategies in the history of American retail. they acquired Dean Witter Reynolds, a prominent investment banking firm. They purchased Coldwell Banker, then one of the largest residential real estate brokerages in the country. They launched the Discover card, positioning it as a direct competitor to Visa and MasterCard. Through their existing ownership of Allstate Insurance, they deepened their presence in financial services. They were constructing, from the top floors of the tallest building in the world, a financial services empire inside the shell of a department store. The boardrooms in the tower buzzed with discussions of interest rates, credit portfolio management, and real estate asset valuations. The quarterly meetings were filled with presentations about financial products, digital payment systems, and cross-selling opportunities between the retail customer base and the newly acquired financial subsidiaries. Meanwhile, at ground level in the parking lots and aisles of Sears stores across the country, a quieter but more consequential conversation was taking place. The stores were showing their age. The carpets were worn. The lighting was inconsistent. The legendary depth of product knowledge that had once been a hallmark of the Sears shopping experience. The store associate who could speak with genuine expertise about the difference between two models of table saw, or explain the relative merits of one grade of pipe fittings over another, was becoming harder to find. Staffing had been reduced. Training had been cut. The retail operations were being managed with a fiscal discipline that preserved margin in the short term but quietly hollowed out the customer experience that had made the brand irreplaceable. The company was directing the energy and capital generated by its retail business toward financial ventures that were exciting and high margin, while allowing the retail foundation beneath them to receive less investment, less attention, and less care than it needed to remain vital. This was the juncture at which the company's trajectory began its long and gradual shift. The story of the city of brick becoming a tower of steel is ultimately the story of a company that lost its awareness of what business it was truly in. Sears had been, for decades, the most sophisticated retail logistics operation in the world. They had a catalog in nearly every American household. They had the deepest, broadest trust of any consumer brand in the country. They had warehouses, trucks, distribution networks, and supplier relationships that were the envy of every competitor in the industry. They were, in the most meaningful sense, the original version of what Amazon would eventually build. If the resources and attention that went into the tower and the financial acquisitions had instead been directed toward computerizing the catalog operation, modernizing the inventory management systems, and building the infrastructure for digital commerce as the internet began to emerge, it is entirely plausible, not as fantasy but as genuine historical counterfactual, that the address you would visit today to order household goods and consumer electronics would be Sears.com rather than Amazon.com. The foundation was there. The trust was there. The network was there. What was missing was the willingness of the leadership to remain focused on the ground-level reality of their business while the view from the 110th floor offered so many more exciting horizons. They did not see Sam Walton arriving. He was building his retail network in rural Arkansas and across the American South and Midwest, with a philosophy rooted in operational efficiency, relentless price discipline, and a deep familiarity with the same working-class American customer that Sears had served for decades. He was doing what Sears had done a century earlier, meeting the customer where they were and offering them more value than the competition. Sears missed him. They also missed the rise of the category specialists, the specialty retailers who moved into a single product category and dominated it with a depth of selection and expertise that a general department store could not match. The sporting goods stores, the home improvement chains, the electronics retailers, and the clothing boutiques each carved away a portion of the Sears customer base, one category at a time, while Sears remained fixed in its tower, confident in its scale, and insufficiently attentive to the shifts happening at street level. The tower still stands today, magnificent and unmistakable on the Chicago skyline. But the name Sears no longer appears on its walls. The lease was transferred, the naming rights were sold to a London-based insurance firm, and the building became the Willis Tower, an extraordinary structure that now houses the offices of companies with no connection to the wish book, to the catalog, or to the railway agent from Minnesota who started it all. The tower was built as a declaration of permanence and supremacy. In a remarkable turn, it became a reminder that the things we build to announce our invincibility are sometimes the most accurate signals of where our attention has drifted from the things that actually sustain us. The long, gradual unwinding of the Sears empire did not announce itself with sudden drama. There was no single day of reckoning, no catastrophic event that the company could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." Instead, the change expressed itself in small and almost invisible ways. It happened on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in 1998, when a longtime Sears customer walked into a store, moved through the aisles, stood for a moment in the appliance section, and left without buying anything, not because the prices were wrong but because the feeling was wrong. The quiet energy that had once made a Sears store feel like a reliable partner had been replaced by something dimmer and more indifferent. The fluorescent lighting cast a pallor over merchandise that sat in arrangements that no longer felt curated. The staff who had once been genuine experts in their departments, people who spent years becoming fluent in the language of the products they sold, had been replaced by a rotating cast of employees with shorter tenures, less training, and no particular connection to the brand they represented. The bargain events that had once felt celebratory now felt like afterthoughts. The stores themselves were aging in a way that communicated, whether intentionally or not, that the company had stopped investing in the spaces where its customers came to spend their time and their trust. The final chapter of the Sears story began in earnest in 2005, when the company was acquired by a hedge fund executive named Edward Lampert. Lampert was a man of considerable financial intelligence and very little retail experience, and the combination proved consequential in ways that are now well documented. He structured a merger between Sears and Kmart, two retail chains that were each experiencing their own significant operational difficulties, on the premise that combining their assets and operational footprints would generate the scale and financial leverage necessary to compete in a changed retail environment. The retail industry observers who watched this transaction unfold noted that the logic of combining two struggling retail operations to produce a stronger one was difficult to defend on its merits. But Lampert was not approaching the transaction primarily as a retail strategy. He viewed the combined entity primarily as an asset portfolio, a collection of real estate, brand names, and financial instruments that, when properly managed, could generate returns independent of the performance of the retail stores themselves. Under this framework, the internal culture of the newly combined Sears Holdings Corporation underwent a dramatic reorganization that departed radically from any conventional model of retail management. Lampert divided the company into more than 30 semi-autonomous internal business units: the clothing division, the appliance division, the tools division, the electronics division, and so on, each operating with its own budget, its own management structure, and its own performance metrics. These units were then placed in direct competition with each other for internal resources, with the expectation that market-style competition would drive efficiency and surface the highest-performing parts of the business. What this model produced instead was an internal environment in which the company's own divisions operated as rivals rather than collaborators. The tools division and the appliance division had less incentive to support each other's promotional efforts than they did to protect their own resource allocations. The clothing department competed against the electronics department for floor space and marketing attention rather than presenting a unified vision to the customer. Rather than competing effectively against Walmart, Target, and the growing ecosystem of online retailers, the company was directing its considerable organizational energy inward, toward internal competition that produced no value for the customer and steadily degraded the coherence of the shopping experience that customers encountered in the stores. The employees throughout the organization felt the effects of this model acutely. Store maintenance was deferred. Renovation budgets were reduced or eliminated. The training programs that had once produced the knowledgeable floor associates who were a defining feature of the Sears brand were scaled back significantly. The store experience, which had been in gradual decline for years before the Lampert acquisition, now declined with greater speed. Customers who had been loyal to Sears for decades began directing their spending to competitors who offered cleaner stores, more helpful staff, and a shopping experience that felt like the company actually wanted them there. But the most historically significant element of the Lampert era was the systematic sale of the brand assets that the founders had built and that generations of American consumers had made genuinely valuable through their loyalty. The Craftsman brand, perhaps the single most trusted tool brand in American history, built over decades on the back of an unconditional lifetime warranty that became part of the cultural vocabulary of the American working man, was sold to Stanley Black & Decker. The Die-Hard battery brand, synonymous across the country with automotive reliability, was sold. The Kenmore appliance brand, present in the kitchens and laundry rooms of millions of American homes for generations, was placed on the market. Each sale generated short-term liquidity that was used to sustain the company's operations for additional months. Each sale also permanently reduced the company's long-term strategic assets and signaled, with unmistakable clarity, that the business model was no longer about building value but about managing a wind-down. The company was selling its most valuable possessions to pay its current obligations, a process that, once begun, tends to accelerate rather than reverse itself. The symbolic culmination of this process occurred in 2009, when the naming rights to the Sears Tower, the building that the company had constructed as its ultimate statement of permanence and market dominance, were sold to an overseas insurance company. The large letters spelling out the Sears name were removed from the lobby walls of the building. For the residents of Chicago and for the millions of Americans who had grown up with the Wish Book, this was a moment that carried a significance beyond simple corporate real estate transactions. The building that Sears had built to declare its indestructibility had been rebranded by a tenant. The name was gone from the skyline it had occupied for nearly 4 decades. It was a moment that captured, in a single image, the full arc of the company's journey from the watchmaker's mailbox to the cloud-level boardroom and back again. In October of 2018, the Sears Holdings Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. The filing was extensive, detailed, and precise in the language of corporate finance. But between the lines of its legal vocabulary was the end of a story that had begun with a young man and a crate of pocket watches in 1886. The company that had once represented approximately 1% of the total United States economy, that had employed hundreds of thousands of Americans at its peak, that had sold houses by mail and backed every wrench it ever made with an unconditional guarantee, had reached the end of its financial runway. The remarkable dimension of this conclusion is not that it happened, but that it did not have to. The irony embedded in the Sears story is one of the most striking in the history of modern commerce. In the era of the Internet, precisely the era in which a mail-order company with a massive logistics network, a national fulfillment infrastructure, and the deepest brand trust in American retail should have achieved its greatest renaissance, Sears was instead completing its long decline. Amazon, the company that disrupted the entire retail landscape in the early 21st century, is not, at its core, a technological invention. It is a reimagination of an idea that Richard Sears understood completely in 1893. People want access to a broad selection of goods, delivered reliably and fairly priced, directly to wherever they happen to live. That is the Wish Book. That is the mail-order catalog. That is the promise Sears made to the farmer in Nebraska and the coal miner in West Virginia. Jeff Bezos did not invent a new form of commerce. He built the infrastructure to execute the oldest form of distance commerce with 21st century efficiency. Sears already had the warehouses. They already had the brand relationship with the customer. They already had the trust. They had the raw material required to become the Amazon of the digital age. What they did not have was the willingness, at the critical moment, to look down from the top floor and see that the ground was shifting. Today, the physical evidence of the Sears empire persists across the American landscape in forms both visible and overlooked. The Sears modern homes, those thousands of kit houses ordered from the catalog and assembled by hand across the early decades of the 20th century, still stand in quiet residential neighborhoods from the mid-Atlantic coast to the Pacific Northwest. They are occupied by families who may sit at their kitchen tables every morning with no particular awareness that the structure surrounding them was selected from a printed page, shipped by rail in thousands of numbered pieces, and assembled by their great-grandparents' neighbors using tools purchased from the same catalog. The Craftsman wrenches, sold to different owners now under a different corporate banner, still sit in the tool drawers and metal toolboxes of garages from Maine to California, outlasting the stores that originally sold them by decades. The connection between those tools and their origin has been severed, but the tools themselves endure, as if honoring a warranty that the company no longer has the institutional memory to fulfill. The empty storefronts remain as well, those large, quieted retail spaces at the anchoring ends of shopping centers built during the great suburban expansion of the mid-20th century. They are not simply real estate awaiting redevelopment. They are physical markers of a shift in the relationship between American consumers and the institutions they chose to trust with their loyalty. They are places where the social contract between a company and its community was maintained for decades before it was finally allowed to lapse, not through any single dramatic decision but through the accumulated weight of many small ones, each made in rooms far above the ground by people who had stopped listening closely to the sound of the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The Sears story is, in the end, a story about the nature of trust in business, what it takes to build it, how long it can sustain an institution even when the institution has stopped earning it, and what happens when it is finally exhausted. You can build the tallest structure ever constructed by human hands. You can print 1 billion pages of catalog and place them in 1 billion mailboxes. You can own the most recognizable skyline in the most commercially powerful city on the continent. But if you stop paying attention to the person standing at the end of the driveway in the snow, waiting for the package you promised, the silence that eventually replaces the sound of that thud will be the loudest thing you have ever failed to hear. The Wish Book has been closed for the last time. The lights in the store have been switched off. And somewhere in the long memory of the American commercial landscape, the echo of a young railway agent's first sale still reverberates. A reminder that the most powerful business empires are not built from towers or financial instruments, but from the simple, radical decision to make a promise to an ordinary person and then keep it, every single time without exception.